May the words of our mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always pleasing to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. This is a very difficult gospel reading, or it has been for me for many, many years. In fact, over the last couple of weeks, knowing that this was coming, I went back and I looked at my notes to see what have I said about the dishonest manager and the wealthy landowner in years past. How do you find God in this? And how can Jesus be commending dishonesty to us? I used to be a manager. I was kind of proud of myself. I was a good manager, at least I thought so. And here we are being told that the manager should be dishonest. It makes no sense. It particularly makes no sense because we've learned to hear the parables allegorically. We've learned to read them as if it were a way of understanding the relationship between God and ourselves. And so we must assume that, well, I guess the rich man has to be God, right? The rich landowner, and that would make us the manager, but it doesn't really work that way. It doesn't make sense. So this week I had a wonderful gift. I heard an interview with Brian McLaren, and maybe you've read some of Brian McLaren's works. He's a wonderful writer. I've got a whole section on my bookshelf of his books. And he explained this parable in a way that just opened it up for me. And so I want to try and do that for you today. And the key to understanding this parable is, once again, context. First off, there's the context that we hear it in. We have just spent the last several weeks of summer working our way through chapters 14, 15, and 16 of Luke, and we heard the parable of the lost sheep. Remember that last week? And then we heard and on that day we also heard the parable of the lost coin. And we didn't hear it, but we know that it comes right after all those two, the parable of the lost son, also known as the prodigal son. And all of those parables were told in response to the Pharisees who were grumbling because Jesus was hanging out with the wrong sorts of people. He was hanging out with sinners and tax collectors. The wrong sorts of people. And we talked about that last week, how that judgment of people might be the problem. Well, this story and the one that follows it are part of that same dialogue. Even though we've changed chapters, there are 5 parables that follow the grumbling of the Pharisees. And the last two begin, there was a rich man. And this is the first of those two. There was a rich man who had a manager. And word came to him that his manager was squandering his resources. The second thing that we need to hear this is historical. The people who were listening to Jesus didn't have any of the struggle that you and I have with this parable. It would have made perfect sense to them. And let me show you how that works. Remember, all of this happens in the context of the Roman occupation. We heard about that and got another emphasis of that when we heard what was exactly wrong with a tax collector, right? The tax collectors didn't work for the IRS. They weren't your neighbor. They were collaborators with Rome, right? And so the tax collectors and sinners that Jesus was hanging out with were identified. And the Romans collected a lot of taxes. The way that the empire worked was that they would spread the empire with their armies and build roads and then gather up wheat and olive oil and wine. And that's how they supported the empire. The whole purpose of expanding was to tax these foreign lands. So what would happen, though, is that the smaller farmers could not afford to pay their taxes. Now, in Israel, there's the north, Galilee, which is where Jesus and his band were from, right? And that's made up of largely of smaller farms. And then there's the south, Judea, where Jerusalem is. And this is where the rich, the wealthy landowner, he lived in the south, okay? And the way that he became a landowner was that those poor Judean farmers couldn't pay the Roman taxes. And so the wealthy landowner from the south came up and said, I have a deal for you. Such a deal. I have such a deal for you. I will pay your taxes for you. All you have to do is give me the deed to your land, and I will pay your taxes for you. You can stay on the land. In fact, you need to stay on the land and work the land, and you pay me my share each year of your harvest, and I'll pay the taxes for you. And so, of course, the landowners end up doing this because they have to. It's the only way they can pay their taxes. And so somehow the rich get richer and avoid paying taxes themselves, and the poor get poorer and become subject to the rich and to the taxes. I'm so grateful that that doesn't happen anymore. You see how hard it was for them? So that's the situation. That's the setup for this. And then we have the characters of the rich man, which we've talked about, and his manager. Who is this manager? Well, the rich man lives, as I said, down in Judea in the south. It wasn't really all that safe to travel a whole lot. And so he's not going to travel up to Galilee to collect his share of the profits each year from all the farms that he's come to own up there. Instead, he hires a local manager. A local manager whose job it is to collect the harvest from each of the farms that he now owns at the end of each year. Now, when it says that he heard that this manager was squandering his resources, what it means is he hadn't managed to gather all that the rich man wanted. The rich man had insisted that he be paid a certain amount and had billed these farmers a certain amount of their harvest each year, and somehow they couldn't pay it all. And so they end up with these huge debts. And that's what we see as the story goes on, isn't it? The manager calls them in. He says, what do you owe? I owe 100 barrels of olive oil. I mean, that's a huge, huge bill. He owes 100 barrels, owes 100 barrels of olive oil. And the manager says, make it 50. Make it 50. And the next guy, what do you owe? 100 containers of wheat. Make it 80. So what's happening here? This manager has been managing the collection of the harvest year after year and has gotten behind. And now he finds out that he is going to be punished for the fact that the farmers haven't paid their bills. And he thinks to himself, am I of so little value to the rich man that he'll throw me away because they can't pay their bills? I am going to change my allegiance. And he changes his allegiance from collecting for the benefit of the rich man to benefiting the farmers, the poor, those marginalized people who had become tenant farmers on their own farms, sharecroppers really, on their own farms. And so he goes to the one and he cuts his bill in half. That's probably not the bill of 1 year. That's what has grown up over the years. He cuts it in half. This is life-giving. And he goes to the next and he makes that 100 containers of wheat into 80. And so the olive oil and the wheat and the wine that they were gathering for the rich people in the south and to pay Rome, he cuts it down. He values the people and his relationship with the people over his obligation to collect for the rich man in the south. Do you see the swap there? It's a change in values. He decided to invest in relationship rather than continue to invest in his obligation to the wealthy man. So, when you look at it that way, this parable goes from being a perplexing story about somehow valuing dishonesty to a story that talks about what do we value? What is most important to us? Is that manager going to value the rich man and his money and his profits, or his relationship with the people? Well, he manages to collect something from the people by cutting their bills, and so they love him. And it turns out the rich man loves him too, because he manages to collect something, even if it's less. So everybody wins in this story. The problem is that it's hard to live that way. It's hard to live as if relationships are the most important thing instead of possessions or wealth or power. The world around us tells us that we should value political advantage. We should value right thinking, that we should value wealth and possessions, and that these are the things that make life work. That's what we're told. We've been talking about that. Remember, we've talked about that gulf that has become so evident in our country between the Democrats and the Republicans, between the liberals and the conservatives. And I talked about that experience of going into someone's home and being lovingly welcomed and enjoying their hospitality over the course of days, only to discover that I, a liberal Democrat, was sitting in the living room of a MAGA hat-wearing Trump supporter. Oh my God, it was a moment of shock, and I realized that my relationship with them was more important than our political difference. I realized in that moment that their willingness to love and include me, they knew who I was. They knew what I did for a living. It wasn't a mystery. It only became clear to me when we started talking politics, and I realized, whoa, we really disagree on this. But the hospitality, the relationship, was more important. That ability to be in loving relationship was more important than whether we could agree on an issue like immigration at the border, or voting rights and how voting should be done, or all of these issues, even important, really important issues like abortion and reproductive rights and LGBTQ people and whether they are fully beloved children of God or not, right? All these are important issues. And they have been used intentionally to divide the country, to gain power one group over another. We have been taught over generations to believe that the person on the other side from us, whether you are conservative or liberal, that their heart, that their values are based in fear and hatred, whereas we know that ours are based in love. That's what we've been told, and that's how we've acted. And Jesus is saying, no, we are in this together. Even the tax collector is a beloved child of God. Even the manager, the steward of the absentee landlord who's been taking for himself and taking too much every year, even that reviled person can be a beloved child of God. But how do we live that way? How can we possibly live as if that were true when the world around us has the constant drumbeat of separation? Red state, blue state, liberal, conservative. Our churches have divided repeatedly The Episcopal Church became the Anglican Church over the issue of women's ordination, right? And a bunch of people left over women's ordination in the 70s and early 80s. And then again at the end of the 70s and early 80s when the new prayer book, the new 1979 prayer book came out. That was the year I graduated from high school. Yes. And I'm old. The new prayer book came out, and again we split. And then in 2003, we had the audacity to consecrate a bishop who was in a committed same-sex marriage. Oh my gosh, and we split again on all of these issues. And I'm not saying these aren't important issues. And I'm not saying that you can't be on one side or the other. But what Jesus is saying is that steward, that dishonest manager decided to value relationship over money. He decided that the people were more important than the prophets. And then it begins to make sense. Regardless of the system that you find yourself in, value the people, value the relationships. Regardless of the role that you find yourself in this culture of division, this culture that glorifies power and fame and wealth, regardless of where you are in the system, value, love, and relationship. Because in the kingdom of God, there's a different economy. There's a different economy. It's not how many barrels of olive oil you have that matters. It's your relationship, your loving relationship with one another and with God. That's the message of this parable. And it's wonderful to have that message today. Because how do we live this way in a world that disagrees? In a world that insists on division, on separation, on reviling, and on breeding contempt for the other? The way we do it is by being Christians together. There are people in this room who profoundly disagree on any number of issues that matter. And yet we are all beloved children of God. We all love God. We all come together at this altar to share in the bread and the wine together. And so today we're going to dedicate this new beautiful instrument because it undergirds and supports our worship, our coming together and celebrating that we're willing to take that risk. We're willing to be countercultural enough to sit with people that disagree with us, trusting that in relationship, in loving relationship, we'll find a way forward together. It may take time. We might find that we're on different sides of issues all of our lives, and yet we can continue together as children of God. And the organ that we dedicate today undergirds the worship of this community that is dedicated to that value, that kingdom value, that love and relationship are more important than wealth and power. And so I'd like to stop preaching and turn from preaching to dedicating this organ with you.